The medical bay of the Stellaris outpost smelled like sanitized regret and broken optimism. Dr. Vrelix, a Quillarian with 12 sensory tendrils, and what he considered an admirably cautious approach to life, stared at the incoming casualty report with 3 of his 4 eyes. The 4th eye was checking the emergency sedative supply. Again, for the 3rd time in as many minutes. "Please tell me that's a typo," he muttered, his translator chip rendering his whistling clicks into something resembling standard Galactic with a heavy dose of exasperation. Nurse Plimka, a gelatinous Sylvain whose species had evolved on a world where the most dangerous predator was a particularly aggressive moss, quivered nervously. "I wish I could, doctor, but the field scanner doesn't lie. Human. Male. Designation Marcus Webb. Current status. Well, currently fighting. Fighting?" Vrelix's tendrils snapped upright. "The report says he has a compound fracture of the left radius and ulna, 3 broken ribs, a punctured lung, significant blood loss, and a concussion that would put most species into immediate unconsciousness." "Yes, and he's fighting? Apparently wrestling a Draxian razor beast according to the field report." "A what?" The doors to the medical bay hissed open before Plimka could answer. 2 Kelvorian security officers, who looked like someone had crossed a praying mantis with a very worried accountant, practically fell through the entrance. Between them, supported under each arm but still somehow mostly on his own feet, was the human. Marcus Webb looked exactly like someone who had recently become intimately acquainted with a Draxian razor beast. Which is to say, he looked like he'd been thrown into an industrial shredder, pulled out, and then thrown back in for good measure. His left arm hung at an angle that made Relix's stomachs churn. All 3 of them. Blood. A frankly alarming amount of it had soaked through his torn uniform. His face was a canvas of bruises, and when he breathed, a wet, rattling sound emerged that should have been followed by immediate system failure and death. He was grinning. "Hey Doc," Marcus said, his voice rough but somehow still carrying that peculiar human quality that Relix had learned to identify as aggressive cheerfulness in the face of doom. "Sorry about the mess. That razor beast had real personal space issues." Relix's tendrils went completely limp. This was a stress response. He was aware it was a stress response. He did it anyway. "Sit down." The words came out as more of a whistle shriek than he intended. "Sure thing. Just, give me a second." Marcus took 2 steps toward the exam table, swayed like a tree in a moderate storm, steadied himself and then actually made it to the table and sat down. On his own, without passing out. The Kelvorian officers looked at each other with their compound eyes, doing that thing that Relix had learned meant they were sharing a private frequency conversation that probably amounted to what in the name of the cosmic void. "Report," Relix demanded, pulling up his diagnostic scanner and trying not to focus on the fact that his patient should be dead. The taller Kelvorian officer Thesic clicked his mandibles nervously. "We received a distress call from Sector 7. A razor beast had escaped from the xenobiology containment area. When we arrived, we found this." He gestured vaguely at Marcus. "By this, do you mean the human?" Plimka asked, already preparing the tissue regenerator with tentacles that were shaking so badly they looked like they were performing an interpretive dance about fear. "I mean the human standing on top of a dead razor beast, using his broken arm to wave at us while asking if we knew any good places to get what he called a beer and maybe some nachos." There was a moment of silence. Marcus coughed, winced, and then actually laughed. It was a short laugh punctuated by that horrible wet sound, but it was still recognizably laughter. "To be fair, I was really hoping the cafeteria would still be open. Fighting makes me hungry." "Fighting makes you hungry?" Relix heard his voice climbing into frequencies that he normally reserved for when the medical station's coffee equivalent ran out. "You have a hole in your lung." "Just a small one," Marcus said reasonably. "There is no such thing as a small hole in a respiratory organ." "Well, it's not a big one." Relix took what humans called a deep breath, which was ironic considering the current situation, and activated his scanner. The holographic display bloomed to life, showing Marcus's internal systems in far too much detail. What Relix saw made him wish he'd chosen a different career, perhaps something safe and relaxing like diffusing antimatter bombs, or negotiating with the Hive Collective. The damage was extensive, catastrophic even. The compound fracture had somehow not severed the major blood vessels, which was either a miracle or proof that human anatomy was designed by a sadist with a very specific sense of humor. The broken ribs had punctured the left lung, which was currently operating at perhaps 40% capacity. The concussion showed clear signs of brain swelling. There were contusions, lacerations, and signs of internal bleeding. And yet, the human's heart, That ridiculous four-chambered engine that ran on spite and caffeine was beating steadily. His blood pressure was low but stable. His remaining lung was compensating with aggressive efficiency. The brain swelling was somehow already decreasing. As Relix watched, frozen in professional horror, the scanner showed the beginning stages of cellular repair that shouldn't have been possible without direct medical intervention. "This is impossible," Relix whispered. "What's that, Doc?" Marcus asked, trying to lean forward and then thinking better of it. "Your species is impossible. You should be dead. You should have been dead approximately 37 minutes ago based on your injury timeline." "Yeah, I've been told I'm pretty hard to kill." Marcus said it like he was discussing the weather. Mild weather. The kind of weather that didn't have holes in its respiratory system. Plimka had finished preparing the medical equipment and was now hovering nearby, her gelatinous form quivering in what Relix recognized as extreme anxiety. "Doctor, should we begin with the lung repair, or the fracture stabilization?" "Both. Simultaneously. And someone get me a full metabolic panel because I need to understand what kind of biological war crime is keeping this creature alive." "Hey," Marcus objected with surprising energy for someone who should be in shock. "War crime is a bit harsh. We prefer evolutionary advantage." "Advantage." Relix positioned the tissue regenerator over Marcus's chest, watching as the device struggled to map the injury through the complex musculature and skeletal structure. "Your species is held together by what appears to be stubbornness and a refusal to acknowledge basic biological limitations." "Pretty much, yeah." The medical bay's main computer chimed, displaying the metabolic results. Relix read them, then read them again, then checked to make sure the scanner was actually functioning and not having some kind of malfunction that made it generate fictional data. "Your blood has a clotting factor that is 17 times more efficient than the galactic standard. Your pain suppression system is flooding your neural pathways with enough natural chemicals to sedate a Kelvorian. Your cellular regeneration has already begun repairing the fracture site, and your adrenaline levels are this can't be right. This much adrenaline should have caused cardiac arrest." Marcus shrugged with his good shoulder.
"Yeah, humans are kind of built different."
"Built wrong is more accurate." Frelix began the delicate process of repairing the lung tissue, his tendrils moving with practiced precision despite his mounting existential dread. Who designs a species that runs on controlled system failures? "Hey, it works. It shouldn't work." Officer Thesic cleared his mandibles. "Doctor, we should mention that during the fight we observed the human throw the razor beast against a wall with his functioning arm." Frelix's tendrils froze mid-repair. "A razor beast, which masses approximately 300 kilograms. Yes, and he threw it. Quite far, actually. Made a considerable dent in the wall, with the arm that wasn't broken." "Correct." Frelix returned his attention to Marcus, who had the decency to look slightly sheepish. "It was kind of in the moment, you know. The thing was trying to eat my face. So I figured, hey, let's see what happens if I just eat it." "Eat it," Relix repeated flatly. "Yeah, you know, throwing something with great force and enthusiasm. I know what yeeting is." The translator chips were updated last cycle specifically because humans kept using words that made no linguistic sense. "What I'm trying to understand is how. I work out." The tissue regenerator was making progress on the lung, the torn tissue slowly knitting back together in a way that should have taken days but was somehow happening in real time. Thanks to Marcus's absurd biology, Plimka had begun stabilizing the fracture, her tentacles working carefully around the jagged bone fragments. "Your species doesn't just work out," Relix muttered, adjusting the regenerator settings. "Your species apparently works out by fighting apex predators and then complaining about being hungry afterward. To be fair, I didn't plan on fighting it. I was just walking back from the gym when it jumped me." "Walking back from the gym?" "Of course. Why wouldn't you exercise before fighting for your life?" "Hey, leg day doesn't schedule itself." Felix made a sound that the translator chip struggled with before settling on rendering it as exasperated disgust mixed with professional concern. He'd been working on the Stellaris outpost for 6 cycles now, ever since the Galactic Council had decided to establish joint military and research operations with humanity. He'd dealt with humans before. He'd treated their bizarre injuries, listened to their impossible explanations, and slowly come to accept that Earth was clearly a death world that had produced a species of absolute lunatics. But this was a new level. "The fracture is set," Plimka announced, her voice carrying that wobbling quality that suggested she was on the verge of a gelatinous breakdown. "But doctor, I'm seeing something strange. The bone fragments are already beginning to fuse. Without the nanite assistance." "Of course they are," Frelix said, because at this point, why wouldn't they be? Human bones, apparently just decide to repair themselves out of spite. It's actually because of the periosteum and the high calcium content, Marcus offered helpfully. And probably all the milk I drank as a kid. Milk? Yeah, you know. Baby cow juice. Relix decided not to examine that particular phrase too closely. His sanity was already hanging by a thread. The lung repair was nearly complete. The tissue now pink and healthy instead of the torn, bleeding mess it had been. Relix ran another scan, checking for internal bleeding. There was some, but it was already clotting, because apparently human blood just decided when it had had enough of being outside the circulatory system, and took matters into its own cellular hands. The concussion is the biggest concern now, Felix said, moving to examine Marcus's head. The bruising was spectacular, a rainbow of purple, blue, and yellow that suggested significant impact trauma. You need to rest, complete rest, no movement, no stimulation, at least 48 hours of observation. Marcus nodded, then immediately winced. Yeah, about that. I've got a training exercise scheduled tomorrow with the new recruits. Absolutely not. Come on, Doc. It's important. We're teaching them hand-to-hand combat. You have a brain injury, a small one. There is no such thing as a small brain injury. You keep saying that about my injuries, but I'm still here, so clearly there's some wiggle room in your definitions. Felix wanted to argue, but the human had a point that made him want to scream. Marcus was still here, still conscious, still making jokes, still somehow fundamentally functional despite having enough damage to kill most species several times over. Officer Thesic shifted uncomfortably. The human has a point, Doctor. We've noticed that their recovery times are unusual. Unusual? Frelix spun to face the Kelvorian, his tendrils vibrating with frustration. Last week one of them fell from a 30-meter platform and broke both legs. He was running again in 3 days. 3 days? Do you know how long it would take a Kelvorian to recover from that injury? 3 months. And that's with advanced medical intervention. Yeah, humans are pretty resilient, Marcus agreed cheerfully. We kind of have to be. Earth is, well, it's not exactly what you'd call safe. That was an understatement of galactic proportions, and everyone in the room knew it. Earth was classified as a Class 12 Deathworld, a rating that meant it was barely suitable for life and yet somehow had produced a thriving biosphere of creatures that all seemed designed to kill each other in creative ways. Humans had evolved on a planet where the weather actively tried to murder them, where the wildlife considered them a food source, and where even the plants could be lethal, and they'd thrived. They'd looked at a world of constant danger and decided to domesticate some of the predators, eat some of the others, and generally establish themselves as the apex predator through sheer stubbornness and the ability to throw things really, really well. I'm keeping you overnight for observation, Relix said finally, because it was the only card he had left to play. And you will rest. That's not a request. Fine, Marcus sighed. But can someone bring me something to eat? I wasn't kidding about being hungry. I'll have the cafeteria send something, Plimka volunteered, already retreating toward the communications panel as if she couldn't wait to escape. The next few hours passed in relative quiet. Relix completed the full treatment protocol, applying regenerative compounds, checking and rechecking Marcus's vitals, and documenting everything for what he was sure would be a medical case study that would baffle researchers for years to come. Marcus, for his part, ate an amount of food that would have sustained a Quilarian for a week, made several jokes about his injuries that made Relix's tendrils curl in distress, and then promptly fell asleep sitting upright. He snored. Of course he snored. Relix settled into his office, pulling up the medical files on humans. He'd read them before, multiple times, but each new encounter seemed to reveal fresh horrors about their biology. Redundant systems, extreme adaptability, the ability to function through injuries that would incapacitate other species, a healing factor that seemed to operate on pure determination, and the psychological profile was even worse. Humans bonded with anything. They made friends with predators. They named their weapons. They sang songs about death and disaster. They had something called extreme sports, which appeared to be activities designed solely to tempt fate. They were insane, all of them, and they were his patients. Relix looked through the window of his office at Marcus, who was sleeping peacefully despite having been on death's door less than 4 hours ago. The human's chest rose and fell steadily, that patched lung working overtime, the broken arm immobilized but already healing. Tomorrow he'd probably try to leave. He'd probably succeed, and in a week he'd probably be back in the gym, lifting weights that could crush a Kelvorian, and preparing for whatever fresh disaster the universe had in store. Because that's what humans did. They broke. They healed. They came back stronger. It was terrifying. It was impossible. It was, Vrelix admitted reluctantly to himself, kind of impressive. Just a little bit. He'd never tell them that, though. Their egos were already insufficiently constrained by reality. The morning shift began with what Vrelix had started calling the Daily Human Incident Report, which was basically a list of all the ways the Deathworlders had managed to horrify the rest of the station's inhabitants in the previous 24 hours. Today's highlights included one human who had fixed a plasma conduit leak with their bare hands, suffering third-degree burns and then complaining about missing breakfast. Another who had apparently gone for a casual jog in the station's high-gravity training area set to twice Earth normal, and a third who had broken up a fight between two Kravik soldiers by simply standing between them and refusing to move. The Kraviks were 3 meters tall and massed enough to crush most species. The human was a female named Riley Okonkwo, who stood maybe 1.7 meters and, according to her file, enjoyed something called kickboxing and baking sourdough bread with equal enthusiasm. The Kraviks had apologized to her. Vrelix was still trying to process that when Plimka oozed into his office, quivering with what he'd learned to recognize as barely suppressed panic. "Doctor, we have a problem. Is it Marcus? Did he try to leave?" Vrelix was already standing, his tendrils reaching for his medical scanner. "No, he's still in the observation room. Doing push-ups." "Doing what?" "Push-ups. With his good arm. He says he needs to maintain his fitness routine and that the broken arm doesn't count because he still has another one." Vrelix made a sound that probably violated several communication protocols. "I'm going to sedate him." "That's the problem, Doctor. You can't." "What do you mean I can't?" "I'm the chief medical officer. I can absolutely sedate an uncooperative patient." Plimka's gelatinous form rippled with distress. "His metabolic rate is too high. He's processing the sedatives faster than we can administer them. I tried a standard dose an hour ago when he started doing something he called core exercises, and it lasted approximately 12 minutes before he was asking for breakfast. This was a nightmare." Vrelix had trained for 6 years on Quilleria Prime. He'd completed advanced xenobiology studies. He'd written a thesis on comparative respiratory systems that had been moderately well received. Nowhere in his education had anyone prepared him for patients who exercised their way through medical crises. He found Marcus in observation room 3. Indeed, performing one-armed push-ups with a form that suggested he'd done this many times before. The broken arm was still in its stabilization field, held carefully against his chest, while the other arm worked with mechanical efficiency. 47, 48, 49, 50. Marcus collapsed onto the floor, breathing hard but grinning. New personal record for post-injury push-ups. That's not a record anyone should be proud of. Relix's tendrils were vibrating so fast they were practically humming. "You're supposed to be resting." "I'm resting. I'm only doing 50 instead of my usual 200. Marcus sat up, wiping sweat from his forehead with his good hand. "Besides, I feel fine. Great, actually. Whatever you did to my lung worked like a charm. Breathing is way easier now." "Of course breathing is easier. I repaired the hole that was preventing you from breathing." "Right. And I appreciate that, Doc. I really do. But I'm good now. So I was thinking I could maybe head out, catch some breakfast, check in with my unit." "You have a healing fracture, a repaired lung, and a concussion that could still result in serious complications." Marcus stood up, testing his balance. He swayed slightly, steadied himself, and then did a few experimental squats. "Concussion seems fine. No dizziness, no nausea. Vision is clear. I've had worse." "You've had worse?" "Yeah, there was this time in basic training when I took a rifle butt to the head during a combat drill. Now that was a concussion. Couldn't remember my own name for like 6 hours. This is nothing." Vrelix felt something inside him break. Not physically, though. Given his current stress levels, that was probably next. It was something psychological, a fundamental acceptance that humans existed beyond normal medical parameters, and that trying to treat them like reasonable patients was an exercise in futility. "Fine," he said, his voice flat with defeat. "But you're wearing a medical monitor, you're checking in every 4 hours, and if you show any signs of complications you come back immediately." "Deal." Marcus extended his good hand for what Vrelix had learned was called a handshake, a peculiar human greeting that involved gripping appendages and moving them up and down. Vrelix wrapped a tendril around Marcus's hand and completed the gesture, trying not to think about how much strength was in that grip despite the human's injuries. Marcus left at what he called a brisk walk and what Vrelix would have called a light jog, moving with confidence that belied the fact that he'd been at death's door yesterday. The rest of the morning proceeded with the usual stream of patients. A Salvain with digestive troubles, a Kelvorian who'd strained a wing joint, A Threxian with a minor case of scale rot. Normal injuries. Reasonable injuries. Injuries that made sense. Then lunch happened. The station's alarm system activated with a wailing screech that made Vrillix drop his medical pad. Emergency lights bathed everything in red. His communicator crackled to life with the voice of Commander Xyloth, the station's Threxian commanding officer. Medical emergency in Cargo Bay 7. Multiple casualties. Structural collapse. Medical teams respond immediately. Vrillix grabbed his emergency kit and ran, Plimka flowing along behind him with impressive speed for someone without actual legs. They reached Cargo Bay 7 to find organized chaos. A support beam had failed, bringing down several tons of equipment and creating a disaster zone of twisted metal and scattered cargo containers. Security teams were already pulling injured personnel from the wreckage. Vrillix did a quick assessment. 3 Kelvorians with crushed limbs. 2 Sylvanas with ruptured membrane sacs. 1 Threxian with a compound fracture that looked serious even by human standards. And there, in the middle of the wreckage, was Marcus. He was holding up a support beam, by himself, with his good arm. The broken arm hung uselessly at his side. But somehow Marcus had positioned himself under a partially collapsed section of the ceiling, and was supporting what had to be at least 500 kilograms of metal and composite material. His face was red with effort, veins standing out on his neck, muscles trembling with strain. Under the section he was holding up were 2 Quilarian engineers, trapped but alive. "Little help here would be great," Marcus called out, his voice strained but somehow still carrying that aggressive cheerfulness. This is pretty heavy." Officer Thesic and 3 other Kelvorians rushed forward with emergency support struts. It took them 90 seconds to get the equipment into place. 90 seconds during which Marcus held that impossible weight with nothing but human stubbornness and muscles that apparently didn't understand the concept of limits. When the struts were secure, Marcus stumbled backward, caught himself, and then immediately turned to help the engineers crawl out from under the debris. Felix reached him just as the adrenaline was wearing off. Marcus's face went from red to pale in approximately 3 seconds. His eyes lost focus. His legs started to buckle. "Oh," he said quietly. "I think I might have overdone it." Then he collapsed. Vrillix caught him with his tendrils, lowering the human to the ground as gently as possible. His scanner was already out, already painting a picture that made his stomachs clench. The fracture had reopened. The lung showed signs of stress. The concussion had gotten worse. Marcus's heart rate was dangerously elevated. His blood pressure was crashing and his body temperature was spiking in a way that suggested imminent system failure. "Get me a medical pod now," Felix shouted, his professional calm completely abandoned. "And someone tell me what happened." One of the Quilarian engineers, a young female named Kesley, stumbled over. The support beam gave way. "We were trapped. The human just appeared and he lifted it. He lifted it. He saved us." Of course he did. Because humans apparently saw imminent structural collapse and decided it was an opportunity for heroism rather than a situation requiring self-preservation. The medical pod arrived, borne by 4 security officers who looked shaken. They loaded Marcus inside with careful efficiency while Vrillix programmed the treatment protocols. Full cellular regeneration, emergency cardiovascular support, neural stabilization, everything his medical bay could throw at a patient who had decided that holding up collapsing buildings was a reasonable life choice. "Will he survive?" Kesley asked, her tendrils wrapped around herself in distress. Vrillix looked at the human in the medical pod. Marcus's vitals were stabilizing already, that ridiculous biology kicking into emergency repair mode. His healing factor was engaging. His redundant systems were compensating, and his sheer stubborn refusal to die was apparently overriding several fundamental laws of medicine. "Yes," Vrillix said, and realized he actually believed it. "He'll survive, because humans apparently don't understand the concept of staying down." The trip back to the medical bay was tense. Vrillix monitored the pod's readouts obsessively, watching as Marcus's body performed medical miracles that should have been impossible. The reopened fracture was already beginning to heal. The lung damage was reversed. The concussion was slowly resolving. It took 6 hours. 6 hours for Marcus to go from critical condition to stable. 6 hours during which Vrillix questioned every assumption he'd ever made about biology, medicine, and the fundamental fairness of the universe. When Marcus finally opened his eyes, the first thing he said was, "Did everyone make it out okay? Not, where am I or what happened or even how." His first concern was for others. "Everyone survived," Vrillix said quietly. "Thanks to you. You held up approximately 530 kilograms of structural debris for 93 seconds while rescue teams deployed support equipment." "Oh good." Marcus tried to sit up, failed, and settled back down. That's good. I was worried I wouldn't be able to hold it long enough. You have re-injured your arm, stressed your repaired lung to the point of near failure, worsened your concussion, and nearly died. Again, for the second time in 2 days. But everyone's okay? Yes, everyone is okay. Everyone except you, who seems determined to commit suicide through heroism. Marcus actually laughed at that. It was a weak laugh, but it was still recognizable as amusement. Sorry, Doc. It's kind of a human thing. Someone's in trouble, you help. Don't really think about it. You should think about it. You should think about the fact that you have injuries, that you have limits. Yeah, probably. Marcus closed his eyes, exhausted. But those engineers were trapped, so not really a choice. And that was it. That was the fundamental difference between humans and every other species in the galaxy. Presented with danger, most species calculated risks, assessed survival chances, made rational decisions. Humans just helped. They saw someone in trouble and their first instinct wasn't self-preservation. It was protection. They'd throw themselves into danger without hesitation, fight impossible odds without concern, endure suffering without complaint, all because someone else needed help. It was stupid. It was irrational. It was, Vrelix admitted to himself in the quiet of the medical bay, the most remarkable thing he'd ever witnessed. The door hissed open and Commander Zaloth entered. The Threxian was massive, scaled and imposing, but he moved with careful respect as he approached Marcus's bed. How is he? Alive, despite his best efforts to the contrary, Vrelix said. The Quilarian engineers are saying he saved their lives. Is that accurate? Unfortunately, yes. He held up a collapsing ceiling while they escaped. Then he collapsed himself because apparently humans believe in delayed consequences. Exoth's tail swished, a gesture of approval. I'm putting him in for a commendation. What he did was beyond courageous. It was beyond stupid, Vrelix corrected. He had existing injuries that should have prevented him from even standing, much less performing feats of extreme strength, and yet he did it anyway. That's humanity for you. Zaloth looked at Marcus with something that might have been respect. When the Council first proposed including humans in the Joint Operations Program, many of us were skeptical. Deathworlders have a reputation. Violent, unpredictable, dangerous. They are all of those things, Felix agreed. But they're also this. Their courage without calculation. Their strength used in service of others. They're the species that looks at impossible odds and says not today. Kaisloth's tail swished again. I'm glad they're on our side. The commander left, and Vrelix was alone with his unconscious patient. He ran another scan, documenting the healing progress. Marcus's body was responding to treatment with efficiency that continued to baffle him. The human would probably be awake and complaining about being hungry within a few hours. He'd probably try to leave again within a day, and knowing humans, he'd probably succeed. Plemka oozed in with a data pad. Doctor, I've compiled the reports from today's incident. The total number of lives saved by the humans' intervention was 7. 2 Quilarians, 3 Kalvorians who were in the collapse path, and 2 Solvans who would have been crushed if the debris had fallen differently. 7 lives. 7 people who would have died if Marcus hadn't been there. If he hadn't ignored his injuries, if he hadn't made the stupid, irrational, completely human decision to help regardless of the cost to himself. Note in his file, Vrelix said slowly, that patient Marcus Webb demonstrates typical human response to crisis situations. Irrational courage, extreme physical exertion beyond recommended parameters, and complete disregard for personal safety when others are endangered. Is that a medical assessment? Plemka asked. No, Vrelix admitted. That's just what humans do. He settled into his office chair looking out at the medical bay where his impossible patient slept. Tomorrow Marcus would wake up. He'd probably make jokes. He'd definitely try to leave early. And eventually, inevitably, he'd end up back in the medical bay with some new impossible injury sustained while doing something heroic and stupid. Because humans were built different. They were built to endure, to persist, to survive things that should kill them, and then come back for more. They were evolution's answer to a hostile universe. The species that had looked at a world trying to murder them and decided to thrive anyway. They were terrifying. They were impossible. They were, Vrelix thought as he began writing his daily report, probably the reason the galaxy stood a chance against whatever dangers lurked in the dark between stars. He'd never tell them that though. Their egos were already insufficiently constrained by reality. But as he watched Marcus's vitals continue to improve, As he documented yet another impossible recovery, Relix allowed himself a small moment of gratitude that Deathworlders existed, even if treating them was taking years off his lifespan. Somewhere in the medical bay, Marcus Webb began to snore again, healing in his sleep, his body already preparing for whatever fresh disaster tomorrow would bring. And Relix, despite everything, found himself hoping the human would be okay, because the galaxy needed more impossible things.